When you picture a family running out of firewood on the frontier, you imagine the problem is scarcity. Not enough trees, not enough time to cut, not enough hands to haul. And that was real, but it was not what killed people. What killed people was water. Water hiding inside the grain of wood that looked dry and felt dry and split clean. Water you could not see until you lit the fire and half your heat went to boiling it away instead of warming the room. The families that froze often had fuel. They just had fuel that was lying to them. This is the story of a woman whose dead father understood that and built his answer into a hill where no one thought to look. Nora Vale Mercer had not planned to stand in her dead father's doorway, with sleet blowing across the threshold and two children pressed against the backs of her legs. She had planned to arrive in August, when the grass was high and the days were long, and Gideon Vale would have been standing on the porch rail with a hand raised and his timber scale hanging from his belt like a sword. She had planned warmth. September had taken that from her. Gideon collapsed on the 14th of that month, hauling fence rails from the creek bottom with a borrowed mule. His heart stopped somewhere between the second load and the third. A neighbor found the mule standing over him, still in traces, and by the time word reached Nora in Sioux Falls, the burial had already been arranged. She sold her husband Edwin's watch chain to pay for the pine box. She sold the pressed tin mirror to pay for the freight ride west. She arrived on Gideon's claim with 9 pounds of flour, 12 pounds of beans, 3 quilts patched from older quilts, 1 cracked axe handle, a 2-year-old daughter named Clara who coughed when the air turned, a 6-year-old son named Amos who had not spoken above a whisper since his grandfather's funeral, and a 9-year-old daughter named Ruth who carried the flour sack on her back like a woman 3 times her age. No team, no coal, no husband. Edwin Mercer had died of typhoid in the spring of 1879, and the harness he left behind was not even hers. Calvin Voss held the note on it, $27 plus interest that grew like frost on a window pane. The cabin Gideon had been building stood half-finished on the rise above a shallow ravine. 2 walls were framed and sided. The third had daylight showing through gaps where the boards had not yet been fitted. The 4th wall was a canvas tarp nailed over studs, and the tarp had torn in 3 places during the ride from Sioux Falls. The stove was a narrow box model meant for a room twice as tight, and its pipe cap rattled in the wind like a tin cup on a string. Nora set Clara on the floor near the stove and stuffed rags into the tarp tiers. She could feel the temperature dropping through the soles of her boots. Through the floorboards Gideon had only half nailed, through the gaps in the framing that whistled when the wind changed direction. Ruth asked if they should start a fire. Nora looked at the woodpile. There was no woodpile. A rusted splitting stump stood beside the barn with an axe head buried in it, but the handle was cracked through and the wedge had come loose. Beside the stump, 3 armloads of kindling, mostly bark scraps and broken lath, enough to heat the cabin for part of 1 night, maybe 2 nights if she burned it slow and kept the children under every quilt she owned. Gideon had sold the visible woodpile in August. Nora found this out from the ledger on his table, a cloth-bound book with entries in his careful hand. Timber sold, $12. Tax paid, $8. Medicine, $3.40. The last entry, written in ink that had not yet faded to brown, read, "Wood accounted for," 3 words that explained nothing. Amos stood at the window and stared at the empty splitting ground. He said quietly, "Did grandfather take the wood with him?" Nora did not answer. She closed the ledger and placed it on the shelf above the stove, where the heat might keep the pages from curling. She told Ruth to count the beans. She told Amos to find every scrap of wood smaller than his arm and pile it inside the door. She told Clara nothing because Clara was already asleep on the flour sack, her breath making small clouds that vanished before they rose an inch. The survival math was simple and merciless. A cabin this size with gaps this wide would need 6 cords of seasoned wood to reach March. 8 if the wind held from the north, which in Dakota Territory it almost always did. 1 cord was a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of split timber, heavy enough to break a man's back loading it. 6 cords meant 768 cubic feet. Nora had 3 armloads of bark. She could not cut fresh timber from the creek bottom because she had no team to drag the rounds and no way to split green wood fast enough with a broken axe. Green willow burned smoky and weak. She had learned that in Sioux Falls when Edwin was sick and the woodshed ran low, cow chips were already under snow. Hay twists would take feed from the cow Gideon had left, and without the cow, there would be no milk for Clara. Coal from town cost $3 a sack at Voss's store, and Voss did not extend credit to widows with outstanding notes. Every path led to the same wall, and the wall was made of cold. Ephraim Rudd arrived on the second morning. He came on afoot because his wagon axle had cracked the week before, and the replacement had not arrived from Brookings. He was 64 years old, a former freight driver with hands that looked like they had been carved from fence posts, and he served as elected road overseer for the township, a title that gave him no salary but considerable authority over who could expect help and who could not. Ephraim had known Gideon. He had respected Gideon's work, or at least tolerated his habit of measuring everything twice and explaining the measurement to anyone who stood still long enough. But respect for the dead did not extend to confidence in the living, and Ephraim had come to the claim not to help but to assess. He walked the property the way a man inspects a horse he already knows is lame. He started at the barn, where the door hung from one good hinge. He crossed to the cabin, ducked his head inside, noted the tarp wall and the stove and the children and the empty wood rack. He walked the perimeter. He checked the well, which had water but no windlass. He stood at the splitting stump and looked at the 3 armloads of kindling as if they had insulted him. Then he turned to Nora, who had followed him without speaking, and delivered his verdict. "You have a frame with daylight in the corners," Ephraim said. "You have a stove that eats fast. You have no coal and no team. You do not have one honest cord stacked anywhere I can see." He paused, and the pause was worse than the words, because it meant he was calculating. A claim like this needs 6 cords to see March, 8 if the wind keeps north. I have seen the wind keep north every year I have been in this territory. Nora said, "My father's ledger says the wood is accounted for." Ephraim looked at her the way a man looks at a child who has said something embarrassing in church. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "a ledger is paper. Paper does not burn hot. Your father was a good man who measured true, but measuring does not fill a woodpile. What I see here is a half-finished cabin, a broken axe, 3 children, and a woman who has never managed a winter alone in open country." He pulled his collar up against the wind, which had shifted north during the conversation, as if to prove his point. A woman with no team and no wood will not see Christmas on that rise. He did not say it with cruelty. He said it the way a man states the temperature or the distance to town, a fact, a measurement. Nora felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a yoke. "What would you have me do?" she asked. Ephraim was already walking back toward the road. "Sell the cow. Pay Voss what you owe. Take the children to Sioux Falls before the road closes. There is no shame in it." "There is no passage money in it either," Nora said. Ephraim stopped. He did not turn around. "Then find someone to take you in." He left. Nora stood at the splitting stump with the wind pulling at her skirt and the sleet beginning again. Inside the cabin, Clara coughed, a wet, loose sound that meant the damp was already settling in her chest. Ruth appeared in the doorway and said, "Mama, the kindling is sorted. What do we burn first?" Nora looked at the empty ground where 6 cords should have stood. She looked at the sagging barn and the half-finished cabin and the hill behind the barn where the grass had gone white with frost, except for one narrow strip along the south face that still showed brown. She looked at her father's ledger entry in her mind. Wood accounted for. Gideon Vale had never lied in a ledger in his life. He was a Michigan timber scaler. He measured board feet for a living. He counted knots. He graded heartwood. A man like that did not write accounted for unless he meant it. But the wood was not here. Nora told Ruth to burn the bark scraps and keep the stove just warm enough to take the edge off Clara's air. She told Amos to fill every pot and jar with water from the well before the bucket rope froze. She told herself that Ephraim Rudd was right about the math and wrong about the answer. She just did not know what the answer was. The strip of brown grass should not have been there. Nora noticed it on the third afternoon when she was pulling the barn door shut against a gust that nearly tore it from the remaining hinge. The snow had been falling for 2 days, not heavy, but steady, a fine dry powder that clung to everything and melted on nothing. Every surface on the claim was white: the barn roof, the cabin, the splitting stump, the frozen ruts in the road, the grass on the hill behind the barn, which rose gently to the south and then flattened into open prairie, except for that one strip. It ran along the base of the hill's south face, roughly 4 feet wide and maybe 10 feet long. The snow there had melted. Not recently, the grass was damp, but not frozen, as if something under the ground was holding just enough warmth to keep the frost from settling. Nora crossed the yard. She knelt at the edge of the strip. She pressed her palm to the grass and felt not heat, but the absence of deep cold. The ground was cool the way a cellar floor is cool, steady, different from the frozen earth 6 inches to either side. She pulled the grass back with her fingers. Under it, soil, then a hard edge. Wood. A plank set level with the ground, its surface rough but intact. She scraped further. Another plank, a gap between them, narrow enough to keep soil out but wide enough to feel air moving through. Air, moving upward through a gap in buried planks. Nora sat back on her heels. A memory arrived, not gently, not at a convenient time, but the way memories do when the body recognizes something before the mind catches up. She was 12 years old, standing in her father's shed in Michigan, a building that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil and the particular sharpness of fresh split oak. Gideon had picked up 2 pieces of firewood from the same tree, split at the same time, and held them out to her. "Hit them together," he said. She did. A dull, flat thud. He took those pieces away and picked up 2 more from a different stack. "Now these." She struck them, a sharp, high crack, almost musical. The sound rang off the shed walls. "That is the difference," Gideon said. He held one of the second pieces to her ear and tapped it with his knuckle. The wood sang. "When the water leaves, the wood remembers it was a tree. Dry wood rings, wet wood thuds, every time." He told her that day what he believed about fuel. Wood did not merely need fire. It needed dryness, airflow, protection, and time. Most men stacked their cordwood outside and covered it with canvas and called it done. Most men lost a quarter of their heat to moisture they could not see. Water hid inside the grain the way debt hid inside a ledger, invisible until you tried to spend what you thought you had. "Keep the water out," Gideon said, "and the wood keeps its promise." Nora had filed that lesson away the way children file everything, as interesting, as fatherly, as something that would matter later in a way she could not yet see. Later had arrived. She dug with the stove poker until iron appeared. A rusted hasp, half buried in frozen sod, bolted to a plank frame that sat flush with the hillside. Below the hasp, the outline of a door. Not a cellar hatch. A door set into the slope at a slight angle, wide enough for a man to walk through if he ducked. The hinges were rusted but intact. A heavy padlock hung from the hasp, its keyhole packed with dirt. Nora pulled at the lock. It did not move. She tried the poker as a lever. The hasp held. She searched the cabin, every drawer, every shelf, every pocket of Gideon's coat hanging on the nail by the stove. No key. She searched the barn. No key. She searched the toolbox with its broken handles and dulled blades. No key. She went back to the ledger. She turned every page. Near the back, in Gideon's careful hand, she found a single line she had missed before. Hill room sealed before first frost. Hill room. Nora closed the ledger. She walked back to the door in the hill. She pressed her palm to the planks and felt the air again. Faint, steady, breathing outward through the wood like something alive. She did not know what was behind this door. A root cellar, a storm shelter, an old dugout from before Gideon built the cabin frame. a space where a man who measured everything might have stored something he did not want measured by anyone else. She did not know. But Gideon Vale had sealed it before first frost, and Gideon Vale had written "wood accounted for" in a ledger he never lied in, and the wood was not anywhere else on this claim. The padlock was iron. The hinges were iron. Iron could be cut, but not with a stove poker and not with a cracked axe. She needed a hacksaw blade or a cold chisel, and neither existed on this claim. Both existed at Calvin Voss's store. Lydia Carver arrived before Nora could leave for town. She came across the north field carrying a cast-iron pan of cold corn mush covered with a flour sack towel, her 5 children strung out behind her like ducklings in descending order of height. Lydia was 38, thin-armed and sharp-eyed, married to a man named Dale who had been away hauling freight since September and might not return before the roads opened in spring. She survived on what Dale sent when the mail moved and what she grew when the rain came, and she had learned to calculate need the way a banker calculates interest, automatically and without sentiment. She set the corn mush on Nora's table and looked around the cabin. She counted the children, counted the quilts, noted the empty wood rack and the stove that was barely warm, and made her own assessment in less time than it took Ephraim to walk the perimeter. "You have about a day," Lydia said. "Maybe 2 if you burn furniture." "I know," Nora said. "Dale left me 4 cords. I cannot spare any." "I know that too." Lydia nodded. It was not heartlessness. It was the math. A woman with 5 children and 4 cords could not give away a single stick without risking her own family. Nora understood this the way she understood gravity, as a force that could not be argued with. But Lydia stayed to help with the tarp wall, and while they worked, she saw the dirt on Nora's hands and the stove poker leaning against the hillside and the cleared patch of ground where the hasp showed. "What is that?" Lydia asked. "A door," Nora said. "In the hill." Lydia walked over and looked at it the way a woman looks at a stain on a ceiling, with the immediate certainty that whatever caused it would be expensive. "A hole in a hill is where damp goes to sit," Lydia said. "If your father put anything in there, it will be mold and mice by now. Root cellars are wet, Nora. That is their nature. You keep turnips in them because turnips want damp. You do not keep anything in them that matters." "It is not a root cellar," Nora said. "How do you know?" Nora pointed at the melted strip. "That snow is gone because air is moving through the ground. A root cellar is sealed to hold moisture. This is vented." Lydia knelt beside the door. She put her hand over the plank gap the way Nora had done. She felt the air. Her expression changed, not to belief, but to the particular discomfort of a practical woman encountering something she cannot immediately explain. "Moving air means rot," Lydia said. "Anything wet in that hole has been feeding mold for months." Nora reached down and pried a scrap of old plank from the threshold where the door met the ground. She turned it over. The underside was pale, dry, and dusty. No green stain, no black spots, no smell of mildew. "That plank is dry," Nora said. "One plank does not mean a room," Lydia said. But she said it quieter than she had said everything before, and she did not take her hand off the gap where the air moved. The risk was clear. Nora could spend the remaining daylight trying to open an unknown locked space that might contain nothing but collapsed earth and dead mice. Or she could use that time twisting hay and gathering frozen weeds from the creek bank, fuel that would burn for minutes and leave ash that held no heat. One choice was safe and insufficient. The other was uncertain and possibly everything. Nora chose the hill because of one word. Sealed. Her father had written sealed, not stored. A man stores potatoes. A man seals something he expects to last. Gideon Vale was precise with language the way he was precise with measurements. If he wrote sealed, he meant the room was built to protect its contents from air, water, and time. "I need to open this door," Nora said. Lydia stood and wiped her hands on her apron. "Then you need a tool that can cut iron." "I know where to find one." Lydia looked at her. "Voss?" "Voss." Lydia said nothing for a moment. Then, "Take Ruth. A child makes a man less willing to be his worst self in public. It was the most useful thing anyone had told Nora since she arrived on the claim. The ride to town took an hour because Nora had no horse and walked. Ruth walked beside her without complaint, her hands tucked into the sleeves of a coat that had been Gideon's and hung past her knees. The road was half frozen and half mud, and every step required a decision about where to place a foot. The sky had turned the color of old iron. Voss's store sat at the crossing where the De Smet Road met the freight trail, a frame building with a false front and a coal shed behind it. Inside, it smelled of lamp oil, tobacco, and wet wool, the smell of men who had been sitting near a stove for too long and had nowhere else to go. 3 of them sat around the stove now, their boots leaving dark prints on the plank floor, their conversation stopping when Nora pushed through the door with Ruth behind her. Calvin Voss stood behind the counter, a man of 46 with a shopkeeper's posture, leaning slightly forward, hands on the wood, the stance of someone who is always ready to name a price. He was not a large man, but he occupied space the way money occupies a room, by making everything else orient around it. He sold coal by the sack, credit by the season, and second chances to no one. "Mrs. Mercer," Voss said. His voice carried the particular warmth of a man who has already decided to say no, but wants you to feel welcome first. "I heard about your father, a loss for the township." "Thank you," Nora said. "What can I help you with today?" "A hacksaw blade. 10 cents. 10 cents. Voss opened a drawer behind the counter and produced a blade, new, still oiled, the teeth sharp enough to catch light from the lamp. He set it on the counter between them. "Cash?" "Cash." Nora placed her last dime on the wood. Voss looked at the dime. He looked at Nora. He looked at Ruth, who stood beside her mother with Gideon's coat dragging on the floor and an expression on her face that was too old for 9. "Mrs. Mercer, I have been meaning to speak with you about the note." He said it casually, the way a man mentions weather. $27, your late husband's harness, plus interest, due by December. That is 6 weeks. "I am aware of the date," Nora said. "I only mention it because—" He gestured at the dime. "Resources appear limited." One of the men at the stove, a man Nora did not know, with a beard that covered most of his face, spoke without looking up. "I heard she has been digging in Gideon's Hill, looking for a root cellar or some such." Another man, younger, laughed through his nose. "Gideon was always measuring shadows. If he had 20 cords hidden somewhere, he would have bragged about it to every man who would listen." "He did not brag," Nora said. Voss smiled. It was the smile of a man watching someone walk toward a cliff and deciding not to call out. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "a locked hole is not firewood. Coal is firewood. Cash is coal." He tapped the counter with 2 fingers. "I have a standing offer. Your father's brass transit and his timber scale for 2 sacks of coal. That would keep the children warm for a week, perhaps longer if you burn conservative." The brass transit was Gideon's most prized instrument, a surveying tool accurate to a 1/4 degree that he had carried from Michigan across 3 territories. The timber scale was a specialized measuring stick marked in board feet, the tool of a man who understood wood the way a banker understands currency. Together they were worth $40 or more to the right buyer. 2 sacks of coal. Nora looked at the transit and scale, which Voss had apparently already examined and cataloged in his mind as future inventory. "No," she said. "No? Those tools are not for sale." Voss leaned forward. His voice dropped half a register, the voice a man uses when he wants the room to hear him being reasonable. "Mrs. Mercer, I sell heat. That is what I do. I sell it to families who need it at a fair price, using a commodity that works. What you are doing—" He gestured vaguely toward the east, toward the claim, toward the hill. "Digging in frozen ground, looking for something your father may have imagined." He did not imagine it. "Is not a plan. It is a hope, and hope is a poor stove." The room was quiet. One of the men shifted on his bench. Ruth stood absolutely still beside Nora, her eyes fixed on the hacksaw blade on the counter. Voss said, louder now, loud enough that Ruth flinched, "Your father left you a hill, Mrs. Mercer. I sell heat." The words landed the way sleet lands on bare skin, not hard enough to bruise, but cold enough to sting. Nora could feel the men at the stove watching her, the way men watch a woman who has been told something true and unpleasant, waiting to see whether she will cry or argue, or simply accept the terms of the world as it has been explained to her. She did neither. She picked up the hacksaw blade. She placed the dime on the counter. Then she saw, hanging from a nail beside the door, a hacksaw frame with a cracked handle and a missing thumbscrew, the kind of tool a store owner keeps meaning to throw away and never does. "Is that frame scrap?" she asked. Voss glanced at it. "It has been on that nail since spring." "Then I will take it with the blade." "Take it." Nora fitted the blade into the frame, tightened it with a bent nail she pulled from her pocket, and walked to the door. Ruth followed without a word. Behind them, one of the men at the stove said, "That woman is going to freeze to death digging in a hill." Voss said nothing. He picked up the dime and dropped it in the till. Outside, the wind had picked up. Snow was beginning to fall again, not the fine powder of the last 2 days, but heavier flakes, the kind that meant a system was building to the northwest. Ruth pulled Gideon's coat tighter around her shoulders and looked up at her mother. "Mama," she said, "does everyone think Grandfather was foolish?" Nora adjusted the hacksaw frame in her hand. The blade caught the gray light and held it. "Only the ones who never listened to him measure," she said. They walked. The road had gotten worse in the hour since they had come, and now the mud was freezing into ridges that caught at their boots. Ruth did not ask any more questions. She walked the way children walk when they are learning that the world does not arrange itself around their comfort, with focus and without looking back. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could only see the outside of what you were building? The hacksaw blade bit into the padlock's shank at 4 in the afternoon, with the light already going blue and the temperature dropping fast enough that Nora could feel the change between one stroke and the next. She had started by clearing the door frame. The frozen sod had to be chipped away from the edges with the stove poker, each swing jarring her wrists and sending up chips of ice that stung her face. Ruth held the lamp, Gideon's old miner's lamp, a flat-wicked kerosene burner that gave a yellow circle about 2 feet wide. Amos stood in the barn doorway watching, his job to keep Clara inside and near the stove, which held its last armload of kindling. The lock was a commercial padlock, case-hardened, with a shank thick as Nora's little finger. The hacksaw blade caught, skipped, caught again. Metal filings gathered on the hasp like gray snow. Nora's right hand cramped after 20 strokes. She switched to her left. The blade skipped and jumped a tooth. She steadied it with her thumb and felt the edge open a thin line across the pad of flesh below the nail. Blood welled, black in the lamplight, and she pressed her thumb against her coat and kept cutting. The sod around the hinges was harder than the lock. It had frozen in layers. Soil, ice, soil, ice. And each layer required a different force. The poker cracked through the ice but skidded off the soil. Nora's arms shook from the shoulders down. Her back ached where the muscles joined her spine. She had not eaten since the corn mush Lydia had brought that morning. 50 strokes. 100. The hacksaw blade was cheap, and the teeth were dulling. Nora could feel the resistance growing, each stroke requiring more pressure for less progress. The lock shank had a groove in it now, a bright line that gleamed when Ruth tilted the lamp. Night came. Not gradually, it fell like a curtain, the blue light going gray and then gone in the space of 20 minutes. The temperature followed. Nora's breath turned solid white. Her fingers stopped aching, which was worse than when they had ached, because it meant the cold was winning. Ruth said, "Mama, your hands." Nora looked. Her right hand was red and raw. The skin split across 2 knuckles where the hacksaw frame had slipped. Her left thumb was still bleeding, the cut deeper than she had thought. She could not feel either injury, and that scared her more than the blood. She kept cutting. At stroke 200, and she had stopped counting. The shank gave. Not with a snap, but with a slow yielding, the last thread of metal pulling apart like taffy, the lock dropping into the frozen grass with a sound that was too small for the hours of work that had produced it. Nora pulled the hasp free. She gripped the door's edge. She pulled. The door did not move. The hinges were rusted to their pins. 2 months of autumn moisture had bonded the iron surfaces together, and the cold had sealed the bond. Nora braced her foot against the hill face and pulled until the muscles in her arms burned. Ruth grabbed the edge below her mother's hands and pulled too. The door groaned, a low, metallic sound that vibrated through the planks, but held. Nora sat back in the frozen grass. She could hear Clara coughing inside the cabin. She could hear the wind building over the ridge to the northwest. She could feel the temperature dropping through her coat, through her dress, through her skin, into the place where calculations lived. The stove had maybe 2 hours of fuel left. After that, the cabin would reach the same temperature as the outside air by morning. Clara's cough would tighten. Amos would not speak at all. Ruth would keep working until her body stopped letting her. The door was free of its lock, but still frozen shut. The solution was 8 inches of rusted iron away, and 8 inches might as well have been 8 miles. Tomorrow she would need Lydia. She would need Lydia's older boys and a crowbar and a fence post and the kind of help that costs something even when it is given free. She would need to spend another night burning the last scraps while the wind tested every gap in the cabin's walls and Clara's lungs fought whatever the damp was building in her chest. But the lock was off. The hasp was free. The door existed, and behind it, behind that frozen iron and those rusted hinges and whatever had shifted inside to press against the planks, something waited. Something Gideon Vale had sealed before first frost. Something he had written one careful line about in a ledger he never lied in. Nora stood. She told Ruth to take the lamp inside and bank the stove with the last of the bark. She told Amos to fill the water pots before the well rope froze solid. She looked at the door in the hill one more time. She placed her hand flat against the wood and felt the air moving through the gap, steady, faint, patient, as if the room behind it was breathing. Whatever waited inside that hill had outlasted Gideon's death, the autumn rains, the first frost, and 2 days of steady snow. It could outlast one more night. Nora was less certain about her children. She went inside. She fed the stove. She wrapped Clara in 2 quilts and held her until the coughing eased. She sat in the dark after the lamp went out and listened to the wind find every crack in the walls her father had not finished building. Somewhere out on the North Prairie, the system that would become the first blizzard of the hard winter was organizing itself into columns of cold and wind that would not stop until spring. Nora did not know this yet. No one in Dakota Territory did. They knew only what the sky told them each morning, and the sky had been saying the same thing for 3 days. Worse is coming. The door was still there. The air still moved. The room still breathed. And Nora Mercer had a hacksaw, a broken axe, 2 torn hands, 3 children, and 1 word in her father's handwriting that meant something no one else could see. Sealed. Morning brought no thaw. Nora woke to frost feathers growing on the inside of the tarp wall, white crystals fanning outward from the nail heads like tiny ferns made of ice. Clara lay against her chest, breathing in short, shallow pulls that rattled at the bottom. Amos was curled beside Ruth under 2 quilts, his knees drawn up and his lips tinged blue at the edges. The stove was dead. The iron had gone cold sometime in the small hours, and the cabin had equalized with the air outside. Nora could see her breath when she exhaled. She could see the children's breath. She could see the moisture on the tarp wall beginning to freeze in sheets. She rose without disturbing Clara. She crossed to the stove and opened the firebox. Ash. A few charred ends of bark no bigger than her thumb. She arranged them in a nest with the last strips of kindling, 2 handfuls, maybe 3, and struck a match. The flame caught, wavered, caught again. The bark ends glowed orange, then settled into a burn so small it looked like a candle behind iron. It would last an hour, maybe less. Ruth appeared at her shoulder, already dressed, already calculating. "The chair rung," she said. Nora looked at the single chair Gideon had built, a rough pine frame with dowel rungs, the only piece of furniture in the cabin besides the table and the shelf. One rung was already cracked. Ruth was suggesting they burn it. "Not yet," Nora said. "When?" "When the door opens." Ruth did not ask which door. She already knew. Nora was on her knees at the hillside by first light, working the stove poker into the gap between the door and the frame, when she heard a voice behind her that she did not recognize. "You are prying from the wrong side." She turned. A man stood at the edge of the barn, leaning on a walking stick cut from ash. He was 58 or 60, broad across the shoulders but narrow through the hips, with hands that were oversized for his frame, the hands of someone who had spent decades gripping tools. His coat was patched at both elbows, and his boots were wrapped with rawhide at the soles. His face was weathered past any guess at handsomeness, but his eyes were clear and focused, watching Nora's hands the way a carpenter watches another carpenter's hands, with professional attention. "Who are you?" Nora asked. "Bernt Kvama." He said it the way Norwegians say their names, with the consonants bitten off clean and the vowels held just long enough to mean something. "I knew your father." "Everyone knew my father. Not everyone listened to him." Bernt came closer. He did not hurry. He walked the way men walk who have bad joints and have learned to plan each step. He stopped at the door and looked at it, not at the hasp or the hinges, but at the frame, the way Nora had cleared the sill, the way she had chipped the sod away from the edges without gouging the planks beneath. "You cleared the sill first," he said. "The sill takes the weight. If I pulled from the top, the frame would tear out." Bernt looked at her. It was a different kind of look than Ephraim's assessment or Voss's calculation or Lydia's practical sympathy. It was the look of a man who has found a correct answer in an unexpected place. "Your father said that," Bernt said. It was not a question. "My father taught me how to listen to wood." Bernt nodded. He set his walking stick against the barn wall, took the stove poker from Nora's hands without asking, and tapped the door. Not hard. 3 light strikes with the flat of the poker against the planks, the way a doctor taps a chest. Then he tapped the lintel above the door, then the side posts. Each tap produced a different sound. The door gave a hollow resonance. The lintel thudded flat. The side posts answered with a mid-tone that carried. "Dead timber thuds," Bernt said. "Framed timber answers." He tapped the door again. The resonance came back clear. "That door has a chamber behind it, not earth, not collapse, open space." "How did you know to come here?" Nora asked. "Voss's store." Bernt said the name without inflection, the way a man names a place he does not enjoy visiting. "I heard you were digging into Gideon's Hill. I heard them laughing about it." "I came because Gideon Vale did not build foolish things." He paused. "He built slow things, things other men did not understand because they could not see the finish from the start." He turned back to the door and ran his fingers along the hinges. "These are forge-welded, heavy. Your father did not use these for a root cellar. A root cellar gets a leather hinge and a latch. These are meant to last." Nora felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but the particular relief of being understood by someone who speaks the same language. She had been speaking to people who heard words. Bernt heard measurements. "I cannot open it," she said. "The lock is off, but the hinges are frozen." Bernt did not answer immediately. He crouched at the threshold, slowly, with one hand on his knee, and put his face close to the gap between the door and the frame. He held still for 10 seconds. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a stub of candle no longer than his thumb. He lit it with a match, cupped the flame, and held it near the crack. The flame bent inward, toward the door, toward whatever was behind it. "Draft," Bernt said. "Air is pulling into the room. That means there is a second opening, an exhaust." He stood, wincing. "Your father vented this space. Front intake, rear exhaust. That is not a cellar. A cellar is sealed. This is circulated." What does that mean? It means whatever is inside has been breathing. He looked at her steadily. But it also means we do not open it blind. A sealed room with draft can hold bad air. It can hold animals. It can hold a collapsed back wall that will bury you the moment you step through. He took the candle and held it at the gap again, watching the flame. It pulled steady and even, not guttering, not flaring. Clean draft. The air's good, he said, but we go slow. Nora said, My children do not have slow. Burnt met her eyes. Your children do not have fast either if a beam falls on your head. We go slow and we go right. It was the first time since Gideon's death that someone had told Nora no and meant it for her benefit. They worked the door for 3 hours. Burnt showed Nora how to free a rusted hinge without breaking the pin. He poured water from a heated pot along the hinge barrels and let it seep into the joint, softening the corrosion a fraction at a time. Between pours, he tapped the pins upward with the poker, a 1/4 inch per strike, pausing to let the water work deeper. It was maddening in its patience. Each pin moved so little that Nora could not see the progress until Burnt pointed to the gap between the barrel and the knuckle. Metal remembers where it was made, he said. Rust is metal forgetting. You remind it. While they worked, Burnt talked, not to fill silence, but to teach. He had been a timberman in the Black Hills before the gold camps went quiet. Before that, a ship carpenter in Stavanger. Before that, a boy who watched his father build root cellars in western Norway using gravel drainage and sod roofs that kept potatoes through winter without a single one going soft. Your father and I argued about ventilation for 2 hours once, Burnt said. He was tapping the upper hinge pin, his strikes so light they barely sounded. He said bottom intake, top exhaust, and the air would move itself because warm air rises. I said that only works if the intake is lower than the floor, so cool air slides in and pushes the warm air up through the flue. We were both right. We were saying the same thing in different directions. Nora held the lamp close to the hinge. When was this? 1878, the year he started digging. Burnt paused his tapping. He told me what he was building. I told him he was building it for someone who did not know they would need it. The hinge pin moved a full inch, then it stuck again. Burnt poured more water. Behind them, Amos appeared at the barn door with Clara on his hip. The child was coughing, not the wet, loose sound of yesterday, but a tighter sound, drier, as if her lungs were narrowing. Nora looked at her daughter's face. The skin around Clara's mouth was pale, and her eyes had the glassy, unfocused look of a child whose body is spending its energy on breathing instead of seeing. Ruth is boiling the last beans, Amos said. He was whispering, the way he had whispered since the funeral, but there was something new in it now, urgency. She says the stove is dying again. Nora looked at the door. The upper hinge pin was loose. The lower was still frozen. 1 more hour, Burnt said. They did not have an hour of fuel. Nora made the calculation that every parent on the frontier made at least once, the one that does not appear in any ledger. She went to the cabin, took the cracked chair rung from the chair, broke it over her knee, and fed it to the stove. Then she took the chair back, a single pine slat, and broke that too. The stove accepted the wood with the indifferent appetite of iron and flame. It would burn for maybe 40 minutes. She went back to the hill. Burnt was still working the lower pin. He did not look up when she returned, and she was grateful for that, because her eyes were burning, and it was not from the wind. The lower pin came free at 11 in the morning. The door swung outward 3 inches and stopped. Something inside had shifted against it. A fallen brace, a stack end, a beam, something solid enough to resist the weight of 2 adults pulling from outside. 3 inches. Nora could fit her hand through the gap. She could feel the air moving past her fingers, cool and dry, with a smell she recognized from Gideon's Michigan shed. Dust, dry wood, the mineral tang of stone. No rot, no mildew, no animal musk. She reached further. Her fingers touched wood, not a beam or a brace. A split, A piece of firewood cut to stove length, its surface rough with the texture of seasoned grain. She gripped it and pulled it through the gap. It was a piece of white oak, split clean, 18 inches long, with deep end checks and a weight that said the water was long gone. Nora held it in both hands. She struck it against the doorframe. The sound was sharp and clear. It rang off the barn wall and came back. Not a thud. Not the dead sound of wet wood fighting its own moisture. A crack. The sound Gideon had made in the Michigan shed when he handed her the dry splits and said, "When the water leaves, the wood remembers it was a tree." Burnt heard it. He straightened. His face changed. "How long has that been drying?" he asked. Nora turned the split in her hands. The end checks ran deep into the grain, the kind of cracks that form after a full season of controlled drying. The bark edges were tight and curled. The wood was lighter than it should have been for its size. "A year," she said, "maybe more." Burnt took the split from her and examined it the way a man who has grated timber for 40 years examines a piece of wood. By weight, by sound, by the depth of the checks, by the color of the fresh surface where the bark had pulled away. He shaved a curl from one end with his belt knife. The shaving curled tight and clean, pale yellow, and held its shape. "This is below 20% moisture," he said. "Possibly 15. Your father seasoned this and then stored it somewhere the weather could not reach." He looked at the 3-inch gap. "There is more in there." "I know," Nora said. "How much more?" "I do not know." The gap was too narrow to see through, and the lamplight only penetrated a few inches before the dark ate it. But the air flowing through the opening carried the smell of dry wood, the way a river carries the scent of the land it has crossed, persistently, and from a source too large to be one split, or 10, or even 100. Nora could feel it. Not warmth, not heat. Something more fundamental than heat. The presence of fuel, stored and waiting, close enough to touch but still locked behind a door that would not open more than the width of a hand. She needed to clear whatever had fallen against the door on the inside. She needed a saw thin enough to fit through the gap and long enough to reach the obstruction. She needed time, and the stove in the cabin was burning the last of the chair. Lydia Carver returned at noon with 2 of her older boys. Thomas, 14, and Dale Jr., 12 theirs, and a crowbar that Dale Sr. had left in the shed. She still doubted the hill. She said as much while Thomas and Jr. tried to lever the door wider with the crowbar jammed into the gap at the bottom. "Nora, one dry stick does not mean a room full of them," Lydia said. She held Clara on her hip because Nora could not stop working, and Amos could not hold his sister and help at the same time. "What if there are 5 pieces? What if your father stacked a small amount and the rest is earth?" "Then I have 5 more pieces than I had yesterday," Nora said. 5 pieces is 1 night. 1 night is 1 night more than 0. Lydia said nothing to that. She bounced Clara on her hip and watched the boys strain against the crowbar. The door moved a 1/4 inch. The obstruction behind it groaned but held. Burnt had been studying the gap with the candle, tilting it this way and that, watching how the flame moved at different heights. He stood and said, "The blockage is low." A stack end fell toward the door. "If we cut it, the door will swing." "Cut it with what?" Thomas asked. The boy was built like his father, tall, heavy-armed, impatient. "We cannot fit in there." Burnt took his walking stick from the barn wall. From inside his coat, he produced a narrow bucksaw blade, no wider than 2 fingers, flexible enough to curve. He wired the blade to the end of the stick, creating a tool that was half saw and half probe, ugly and improvised and exactly right. "Your father would have liked this," he said to Nora. He fed the blade through the gap at the bottom of the door. The sawing was blind. He could not see the obstruction, only feel it through the vibration in the stick. Nora watched the sawdust fall through the gap, fine and pale, the color of seasoned hardwood. Each stroke sent a whisper of dry wood dust into the air. Twice the blade snagged on something, and Burnt had to withdraw and reset. Once the stick slipped, and he drove the back of his hand into the door edge, hard enough to split the skin. He wrapped it with a strip torn from his shirt cuff and kept going. The obstruction gave way at 1:30. A sound came from inside, a settling like a stack of books shifting on a shelf, and the pressure against the door released. Burnt pulled the saw free. Thomas and Junior threw their weight against the crowbar. The door swung open to a foot, then 2 feet, then far enough for a person to pass through sideways. The smell hit them first, every one of them. Not rot, not damp, not the closed-in staleness of a root cellar. Dry wood, split wood. The clean, mineral, almost sweet smell of hardwood that has lost its water and kept its structure. It filled the doorway like a breath held for 2 years finally released. Burnt tied a clothesline around Nora's waist. He handed the free end to Ruth, who had appeared from the cabin with the gravity of a child who has understood that the next 60 seconds will determine the rest of the winter. "Keep one hand on the right wall," Burnt said. "If the floor drops, fall backward. If you hear cracking overhead, come out. Do not go more than 10 paces without calling back." Nora took the lamp. She turned sideways and stepped through the gap. "Decourts." The vault revealed itself in pieces, the way a dark room reveals itself when a match is struck. First the nearest shapes, then the middle distance, then the far wall appearing from nothing like a thought completing itself. The first thing Nora saw was wood, not a stack, a wall. Split firewood stacked from the gravel floor to within 6 inches of the ceiling, each piece cut to stove length, each piece laid with the bark edge facing out so the stack would hold its own weight. The wall of wood ran from the door to a depth she could not yet see, broken by a narrow aisle down the center, just wide enough for one person to walk. She took 2 steps into the aisle. The lamp threw shadows that moved like living things, sliding over the stacked surfaces, catching the pale end grain of hundreds of splits. The air was cool, not cold, not warm, but the steady temperature of Earth 6 feet below the surface, somewhere near 45 or 50 degrees. Dry air, moving air. She could feel a faint current on her face, flowing from behind her toward the rear of the vault. She took another step. The right wall of wood ended, and another began, separated by a support post. A squared timber sunk into the gravel floor and braced against the ceiling frame. On the post, in Gideon's handwriting, a chalk mark, 5 cords, on one side of the aisle. Nora raised the lamp higher. The left wall mirrored the right. Stacked splits, bark out, floor to ceiling. Another post, another chalk mark. 10. She walked further. The aisle stretched ahead of her, straight as a surveyor's line, the gravel crunching under her boots. The ceiling was framed with squared timbers, each one notched into the side beams, the joints tight despite 2 years of settling. The walls were planked behind the stacks, rough-cut boards set vertically, backed by packed sod. Between the planks and the sod, she could see the gravel drainage layer Burnt had predicted, a 6-inch bed of creekstone that lined the floor and ran up behind the lower boards, channeling any seeping water toward a trench that angled away from the vault. Post. Chalk mark. 15. The vault was 32 feet deep. Nora reached the back wall and raised the lamp to the ceiling. There, set into the upper corner, was the rear exhaust, a clay drain tile connected to a stovepipe section that angled upward through the sod. The pipe was partially blocked. A bird nest, old and compacted, and a crust of frost had narrowed the opening to less than half its original diameter. Air still moved through it, but weakly, a whisper where there should have been a breath. Nora turned and looked back toward the door. The light from outside was a thin rectangle, impossibly bright after the dark. She could see Burnt's silhouette in the opening. She could hear Ruth's voice calling, "Mama?" Post. Last chalk mark. 20 cords. Nora stood in the center aisle of her father's fuel vault and let the numbers settle into her body. 20 cords of seasoned hardwood, oak, ash, box elder, split, stacked, dried, stored on raised slat floors with 6 inches of gravel beneath, protected by sod insulation above and plank walls on every side, ventilated by a low front intake and a high rear exhaust, sealed before the first frost by a man who understood that wood keeps its promise only if water cannot find it. 20 cords was enough for 3 winters, more than enough for one. It was enough to heat the cabin through the worst Dakota could deliver, with surplus to share, with margin for error, with room to breathe. Her father had not lied in his ledger. He had not imagined the wood, or forgotten it, or made a mistake. He had spent 2 years cutting, splitting, hauling, seasoning, and stacking 20 cords of hardwood in a room he built into a hill, and he had sealed it before frost, and he had written 3 words that said everything and nothing. Wood accounted for. Nora sat down on the gravel floor. She put the lamp between her knees. She pressed her hands to the nearest splits, 2 of them, one in each palm, and felt the dry grain under her torn skin. She did not cry. She did not thank the dark, or speak to her father's ghost, or feel rescued. She felt the particular specific weight of a woman who has been doing math that does not work and has just found the missing number. The equation balanced. The variable was here. She stood, took 1 split in each hand, and walked back to the door. Burnt was waiting. She handed him the first split. He struck it against the door frame without being asked. The sound cracked across the frozen yard like a gunshot. Clear, sharp, dry. "How much?" he asked. 20 cords, Nora said. Gideon marked them on the posts. Burnt set the split down carefully. The way a man sets down something he suddenly understands is not just wood. He removed his hat. He looked at the doorway and then at the hill above it, the sod-covered slope that had looked like nothing, that Ephraim had walked past, that Voss had dismissed, that every man at the store had laughed about. "He built it for you," Burnt said. "He just did not get to show you where the door was." The vault was open. The wood was real, but the equation was not yet solved, and anyone who has survived a frontier winter knows the difference between having fuel and having heat. Nora learned this in the next 8 hours. The rear flue was blocked. Not completely. The weak draft through the bird nest and frost proved that, but enough to strangle the airflow that Gideon's design depended on. Without full ventilation, the vault would slowly gather moisture from the earth walls. More immediately, without proper draw, the cabin stove would smoke and choke when they burned the stored wood, because the vault's intake vent was connected to the cabin's air cycle. Burnt explained this through action, not lecture. He held the candle at the vault's front opening and showed Nora how the flame barely moved. A healthy vault should pull air hard enough to flicker a candle at arm's length. 20 cords of perfect wood and a blocked throat, Burnt said. Your father would have cleared that flue in September. The flue sat at the top of the hill, roughly 14 feet above the vault floor, accessible from outside only by climbing a slope that was now covered in frozen grass and crusted snow. Burnt could not climb it. His left leg, the one he favored when he walked, the one that made him lean on the ash stick, had been broken in 2 places in a mine timber collapse in the Black Hills. It bore his weight on flat ground. It would not bear it on a frozen slope. Nora would have to clear the flue herself, but not today. The light was already failing, and the first priority was heat for the children. They formed a line, Nora inside the vault, Ruth at the door, Lydia in the yard, Thomas at the cabin, and passed splits hand to hand from the dark into the dying afternoon. Each piece weighed between 3 and 5 pounds. Each piece was dry enough to catch from a coal and hold a flame without hissing or popping or releasing the clouds of steam that wet wood sends into a room like smoke. Nora loaded the stove with 4 splits of white oak and a handful of bark shavings from the vault floor. She struck a match. The flame caught the shavings, licked the bark edge of the nearest split, and climbed. No hiss. No crackle of water, pockets boiling inside the grain. No smoke curling from the joints in the stovepipe. The fire was clean, yellow at the base, orange at the tips, steady. It sounded like fabric tearing, that low rushing whisper of air being consumed by heat. Within 20 minutes, the stove was warm to the touch. Within 40, the air in the cabin had shifted from sharp to bearable. Clara stopped coughing, not because she was cured, but because the air around her had stopped attacking her lungs. Ruth stood by the stove with her palms held out, and did not say anything. Amos touched the stovepipe and pulled his hand back. It was hot, actually hot, for the first time since they had arrived. Lydia sat at the table with Junior and Thomas and watched the fire through the stove door's vent slots with an expression that Nora recognized. It was the expression of a woman revising her calculations. "How much did you say was in there?" Lydia asked. 20 cords. Lydia looked at the fire. She looked at Nora. She looked at the window, where the snow was falling heavier now, the flakes large and wet. "You need to fix that flue before the real cold comes," Lydia said. "This fire is good, but if the vault clogs, your wood will take on moisture and you will have 20 cords of kindling instead of fuel." It was the first time Lydia had said "your wood" instead of "that hole." Nora noted it, but did not remark on it. Conversions do not happen in a single sentence. They happen in the space between doubt and evidence, and Lydia was standing in that space now, looking at a clean fire and recalculating. Ephraim Rudd returned that evening. He did not explain why. He simply appeared at the door, stamping snow from his boots, and stood inside the cabin looking at the stove with the particular attention of a man who knows exactly what a healthy fire looks like and is surprised to find one where he expected cold. "Where did you get the wood?" he asked. "My father's hill," Nora said. Ephraim said nothing. He crossed to the stove and held his hand near the pipe. He opened the firebox door and looked at the coals. He picked up a split from the pile beside the stove and weighed it in his hand and thumped it with his knuckle. The sound carried. He put the split back. He looked at Nora for a long moment, the kind of look that contains a sentence the speaker has decided not to say, and left without closing the door behind him. Nora closed it. She did not know what the look meant. She was too tired to interpret expressions, too exhausted from the hacksaw and the hinges, and the hours in the dark, and the weight of finding 20 cords her father had hidden in a hill. She ate beans with the children. She banked the stove with 3 splits of ash for the night. She wrapped Clara in every quilt they had and laid her close to the heat. The stove held through the night. That alone was new. Since arriving on the claim, Nora had never woken to a warm cabin. The fire had always died by 2 or 3 in the morning, and the cold crept back so gradually that by dawn it felt like the heat had never existed. But the seasoned oak burned long and even, each split collapsing into a bed of coals that held temperature for hours. Nora woke before the children. The cabin was not warm, exactly. The tarp wall still admitted cold, and frost still grew on the exposed nail heads, but the air did not bite. It merely pressed. The stove ticked quietly as the iron expanded with the residual heat of last night's fire. She added 2 splits. She boiled water. She stood at the window and looked at the sky, which had turned the yellow-gray of a bruise. The color that means snow is not coming. It is already here. The first blizzard of the hard winter hit Dakota Territory on October 16th, 1880, and it did not arrive the way storms arrive in places with mountains or forests to break the wind. It arrived horizontally. The wind came from the northwest at a speed that turned snow into sand, driving it through every crack and gap and nail hole in every structure on the prairie. The temperature, which had been hovering near 20 degrees, dropped to 0 by noon and continued falling. Stay with this moment, because the difference between a room full of wood and a room full of heat is 1 blocked breath of air. Nora's cabin was not ready. The tarp wall bowed inward with the first real gust and tore free of 2 nails. Snow blasted through the gap and hit the back of the stove, turning to steam with a hiss that sounded like an animal. Ruth grabbed Clara and pulled her away from the wall. Amos threw a quilt over the gap, but the wind sucked it through like a tongue pulling cloth from a hand. Nora nailed the tarp back. The wind tore it again. She nailed it a 3rd time, driving the nails through a strip of lath to widen the hold. It held barely, flapping with a sound like a loose sail on a mast, admitting a constant stream of fine snow that gathered on the floor in a white crescent. The stove was consuming wood faster now. The draft from the gaps fed oxygen to the fire, which burned hotter but shorter, each split lasting half the time it should have. Nora was feeding the stove every 30 minutes. At that rate, the pile beside the stove, 15 splits, maybe Astar, would last until dark. Then someone would have to cross the yard in a blizzard to reach the vault, and the vault's flue was still blocked. Burnt arrived at mid-morning. He had crossed from his claim a mile and a half to the southwest in conditions that should have kept any man with a bad leg indoors. His coat was white. His eyebrows were white. His walking stick was caked with ice where the snow had frozen to the bark. "The flue," he said. Nothing else. He understood the problem without being told. Nora looked at the hill through the window. The south face was a wall of white. Snow had drifted against the vault door to a depth of 2 feet. The rear vent at the top of the hill was invisible under the accumulation. "If the vent stays blocked, the vault will pull moisture from the snow through every gap in the sod," Burnt said. "Within a week, your top stacks will take on water. Within a month, the lower stacks will follow." "Then I go up," Nora said. "The slope is ice." "Then I go up on ice." Burnt did not argue. He had learned in the 3 days of knowing Nora Mercer that argument produced the same result as agreement. She would do the thing. The only variable was whether she would do it prepared or unprepared. He made her wait 30 minutes. In that time, he built the tool she needed from what was available, a broom handle stripped of its bristles with a loop of baling wire wired to the end. The wire was stiff enough to probe and flexible enough to hook. He wrapped a rag around the wire's base to stop it from slipping through the pipe. "Push straight down," he said. "Do not twist. The nest will compress, and if you twist, the wire will catch and you will lose the tool inside the pipe." "What if the frost has sealed the pipe shut?" "Then you dig the frost out first, with your hands if you have to, but do not break the pipe. Clay tile will not survive a blow in this cold." Nora took the broom handle. She wrapped a cloth around her face and tied a rope to her waist. Ruth held the other end at the barn door, paying it out as her mother climbed. The slope was 40 feet from base to crest. Under normal conditions, it was an easy walk, grassy, south-facing, gentle enough for a child. Under a layer of ice-crusted snow with a 30-mile wind, it was a problem that grew worse with every step. Nora's boots punched through the crust, sank to her shins, and then the crust held her weight until she shifted, at which point it broke again and she slid. She drove the broom handle into the snow and pulled herself up 3 feet, slid back 2, drove the handle in again. The wind hit her from the right side and did not stop. It was not gusting. It was continuous, a pressure that leaned against her body and tried to peel her off the slope the way wind peels bark from a dead tree. Snow filled her mouth when she breathed. It packed into her collar and melted against her neck. Her hands went numb within 5 minutes, and she could not feel the broom handle anymore. She was gripping it by memory, by the shape her fingers had made, trusting that the muscles would hold what the nerves could no longer confirm. Halfway up, her right foot found nothing. The snow had drifted over a shallow washout in the hillside, and her boot went through into open air. She fell to her waist, the broom handle slamming across the slope above her, the rope snapping tight at her waist. Ruth screamed, a thin, high sound that the wind stole before it reached the barn. Nora lay in the snow and breathed. Her heart was hammering. Her ribs ached where the rope had caught. She could not feel her feet, and for a moment she could not feel the hill under her, could not tell whether she was still on solid ground or hanging in a drift over nothing. She dug herself out. She kept climbing. The vent pipe appeared at the crest of the hill as a dark circle in the snow. Or what should have been a dark circle. It was white, packed solid. Frost and snow had sealed the opening completely, compressing the bird nest beneath into a plug that blocked the entire exhaust. Nora drove the broom handle into the pipe. It went 2 inches and stopped. She pushed harder, 3 inches. The resistance was solid, packed debris, ice crystals, and the compressed nest all fused together. She pulled the handle out, reversed it, and used the wire loop to scrape the frost away from the rim. Chunks of ice fell into the pipe. She could hear them rattling down the clay tile into the vault below. She went back to the wired end. Push, scrape, push. The plug broke in pieces. each one dropping with a hollow echo that meant the pipe was clearing. With each piece that fell, she could feel the draw changing, the air beginning to pull through the hill from front to back, from intake to exhaust, the way Gideon had designed it to move. The final piece gave way, and the effect was immediate. A rush of air came up through the pipe, not warm, not cold, but moving, fast enough to stir the snow around the rim, fast enough to hum against the clay edge. The vault had taken its first full breath. Nora lay on her stomach at the top of the hill, with the wind trying to roll her off, and the snow filling her collar and the broom handle still jammed in the pipe. She could feel the draw through the handle, a vibration steady and strong, like a pulse. She pulled the handle out. She climbed down the hill faster than she had climbed up, half sliding, the rope paying out behind her. When she reached the barn door, Ruth grabbed her coat and pulled her inside. Nora's hands were white. Her face was raw. She could not feel anything below her elbows. But inside the cabin, the stove had changed. The fire, which had been burning fast and short, fed by the gaps in the walls and fighting the blocked ventilation, was now drawing smooth. The flame had steadied. The splits were burning longer, their coals building instead of collapsing. The temperature in the cabin was climbing, not because the fire was hotter, but because the fire was more complete. The wood was giving up its heat instead of wasting it. Burnt checked the cabin stove and then walked, slowly leaning hard on the stick, to the vault. He held the candle at the front intake. The flame bent sharply inward and held. "Full draw," he said. Clara was breathing easier. The cabin air had shifted from damp and cold to dry and bearable. The tarp walls still flapped, and the snow still crept through, but the stove was winning now, pushing heat faster than the wind could steal it. That afternoon, with the blizzard still hammering the walls, Nora learned what Gideon's vault could do. She burned one split of oak every 90 minutes and held the temperature in the cabin above 45 degrees at floor level. The wood caught clean, held its fire, and collapsed into coals that radiated for an hour after the flames died. No smoke, no hiss. No steam from water boiling out of the grain. Each split was a promise kept, dry, dense, full of heat that belonged entirely to the fire. By contrast, Orrin Meach, a young bachelor on the claim 2 miles east, was burning green cottonwood, his dugout filled with smoke. The chimney could not clear the vapor because the wood was releasing as much water as heat, and the water condensed in the pipe and ran back down as creosote-brown liquid that stained the ceiling and made the air taste like tar. By late afternoon, Orrin's eyes were streaming, and his lungs were burning, and his fire was barely producing enough heat to keep the water pail from freezing. He tried to reach town. He made it half a mile before the wind knocked him flat, and the snow buried him to his thighs, and the cold took his hands before it took his legs, and he fell. Lydia's oldest boy, Thomas, found Orrin face down in a drift behind the creek bank. Thomas had been coming from his own house to check on Nora, carrying 2 pieces of the dry oak she had given Lydia the day before. He dragged Orrin to Nora's cabin door and pounded until Nora opened it. Orrin was gray. His fingertips were white. His lips were the color of the sky, that yellow-gray that means the body has begun negotiating with the cold about which parts it will keep and which it will surrender. They pulled him inside. Nora fed the stove 3 splits at once. Oak, the fastest heating wood in the vault, and built the fire to its highest point. Ruth heated stones from the creek that Amos had gathered days earlier. Lydia wrapped the stones in rags and pressed them against Orrin's hands, his armpits, his feet. Burnt held broth to his mouth and tilted it until the liquid ran into the man's throat. Orrin lived. He lost the tip of his left ring finger to frostbite and 2 toenails to thaw, and he spent 3 days on Nora's floor coughing and shaking. But he lived because the stove was hot, and the stove was hot because the wood was dry, and the wood was dry because a man who understood fuel had spent 2 years building a room in a hill and sealing it before frost. Ephraim Rudd arrived at dusk, having walked from his own claim through conditions that would have kept him home on any other night. He had heard about Orrin from Thomas. He stood inside Nora's door and looked at the stove, which was burning with a steady, clean heat that Ephraim had never seen from prairie fuel, and then at Orrin, who was alive on the floor, and then at the pile of splits stacked beside the wall, each one pale and dry and cut to length. Ephraim picked up one split. He weighed it. He struck it against the wall. The crack ran through the cabin. He put it back. He said nothing. He sat down in the corner, and he stayed through the night. Over the first 36 hours of the blizzard, Nora burned less than a third of a cord. She kept the cabin above 45 degrees near the stove, warm enough for Clara to breathe, warm enough for Oren's blood to move, warm enough for 5 children and 4 adults to survive without burning furniture or twisting hay or feeding the stove every 20 minutes. Green wood would have consumed a full cord in the same period out, and half of that cord's energy would have gone to boiling the water out of the grain instead of heating the room. On the second night, Lydia's stove went cold. The 4 cords Dale had left were good wood, but they were outside under a tarp that the blizzard had torn away, and 2 days of driving snow had soaked the top layer and frozen the splits together. Thomas came to Nora's door at midnight with a request he did not want to make. Nora did not hesitate. She loaded a sled runner, a flat board with rope handles, with 12 splits of ash, and told Thomas to take them. Lydia's 5 children needed heat more than Nora needed margin. Ruth watched from the doorway as Thomas dragged the sled into the dark. She said, "Mama, if we give it away, we will run out." 20 cords, Nora said. "We will not run out." "How do you know?" Nora looked at the vault door, visible through the barn as a dark rectangle against the white. Snow was drifting against it, piling in a crescent that would need to be cleared by morning, but the draft was holding, the air was moving, the wood was dry. "Because your grandfather measured it," Nora said, "and he measured true." The blizzard spent itself by the 3rd morning. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan to a whisper. The snow stopped. The sky opened to a blue so cold and deep, it looked like the air itself had frozen solid. Nora stepped outside and could not see the road. She could not see Lydia's claim. She could not see anything except white ground and blue sky and the smoke rising from her stovepipe. Thin, clean, almost colorless. The smoke of dry wood burning right. Somewhere under the drifts, the frontier was rearranging itself. Claims that had been marginal were now desperate. Claims that had been comfortable were now marginal. The hard winter of 1880 through 1881 had begun, and it would not end until April, and before it was over it would kill cattle by the thousands, close the railroads, starve towns, and test every structure and every supply and every person on the Dakota prairie. Nora had 20 cords of seasoned hardwood in a ventilated, drained, earth-tempered vault that held 45 degrees when the air outside dropped to 15 below. She had already shared with 2 families. She had already saved one man's life. She had already burned less than 1 cord. But the vault was no longer a secret. Every person who had been in her cabin during the blizzard knew what was inside the hill, and every person who knew would tell someone else. And eventually the news would reach Calvin Voss, who sold coal by the sack, who held the note on Nora's harness, and who had told her in front of witnesses that her father left her a hill. He had been right. He just had not understood what was inside it. The blizzard had rearranged the world, and with it, the order of things. Within 2 days of the storm breaking, men began arriving at Nora's claim. They came on foot because the drifts had buried the road to a depth that no wagon could cross. They came singly and in pairs, their faces raw from cold, their boots wrapped in burlap, their questions all variations of the same question. How? Nora had expected curiosity. She had not expected the particular quality of attention that men give to something they do not understand and cannot dismiss. These were men who had survived Dakota winters before, men who had burned hay twists and cow chips and green cottonwood and coal bought at $3 a sack. They knew what a fire was supposed to look like. They knew what smoke was supposed to smell like. And what they had heard from Lydia's boys and from Oren Meach, who was now sitting upright and talking, did not match anything they knew. A man named Tollef Haugen, who had a homestead 4 miles south, arrived on the 3rd morning and asked to see the vault. Nora took him in. He stood in the center aisle with a lamp and counted the chalk marks on the posts and touched the splits with both hands and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "My father would have understood this. I do not." Nora showed him the gravel floor. She showed him the gap beneath the lowest row of stacks where air could pass. She showed him the front intake and described the rear exhaust, which was now drawing clean since she had cleared it. She did not lecture. She picked up 2 splits, one from the vault, one from Tolif's sled, a piece of green elm he had brought from his own pile, and struck them together. The vault split cracked. The elm split thudded. "That is the difference," Nora said. "Water." Tolif turned the elm split in his hands. He had cut it in September, stacked it outside under canvas, and considered it seasoned. It weighed nearly twice what the vault split weighed, and when Nora shaved a curl from its end with Burnt's belt knife, the shaving crumbled instead of curling. "How long to dry it right?" Tolif asked. "A year, maybe longer if you stack it wrong." "I do not have a year." "No," Nora said, "you do not, but you have next year, and the year after that." It was the first time she had spoken about the vault, not as a rescue, but as a principle. The wood was not magic. The room was not magic. The magic, if you could call it that, was time. Time given to wood to lose its water, protected from weather that would give it back. Tolif left with 6 splits of oak and a question he could not stop turning over. What if he had built a storage room 2 years ago? Ephraim Rudd's conversion did not come in a single moment. It came in stages, the way frost leaves a window, from the edges inward, slowly, resisting at the center where the cold has held longest. The first stage had been silence, Ephraim sitting in Nora's cabin through the blizzard night, watching the stove burn clean, saying nothing. The second stage was presence. He returned the next day, and the day after, always with a practical reason, checking the road conditions, delivering a message from town, but always ending up in the cabin or the barn or the doorway of the vault, watching Nora work with an expression that shifted between discomfort and something that might have been respect. The third stage came on the 5th day after the blizzard, when Nora was restacking a section of the vault where the fallen crossbrace had scattered 30 splits across the aisle floor. Ephraim appeared at the vault door. He did not enter. He stood in the opening with the light behind him, his hat in his hands, and watched Nora lift each split, inspect it for damage, and place it back on the stack with the bark edge out. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. Nora did not stop working. "Mr. Rudd, I told you a woman with no team and no wood would not see Christmas on that rise." "You did." "I was wrong." Nora placed a split on the stack. She straightened. She looked at Ephraim, who was holding his hat the way men hold hats when they are aware that their hands need something to do. "You had a better team than horses," Ephraim said. "You had your father's measure." He put his hat back on. He stepped inside the vault, the first time he had entered, and walked the center aisle from door to rear wall. He counted the posts. He read the chalk marks. He crouched at the drainage trench and ran his fingers through the gravel. He stood at the rear vent and felt the draw against his face. When he came back, he said, "Your father offered to show me this once. 1879, I think. He said he had something to show me about storage. I told him I did not have time for his measurements." He left. But the next morning, he returned with a sled and asked Nora what she needed hauled. The authority skeptic had become the first volunteer. Lydia's conversion was different. Lydia had never doubted Nora's determination. She had doubted the physics. A hole in a hill is where damp goes to sit. That had been Lydia's position, and it was a position grounded in experience. Every root cellar Lydia had ever seen was damp. Every dugout sweated in warm weather and frozen cold. The idea that an underground room could keep wood dry contradicted everything the prairie had taught her about earth and water. The 12 splits of ash that Nora had sent during the blizzard changed the terms of the argument. Lydia had burned them in her own stove and timed them against her own wood. The vault ash burned 90 minutes per split. Her own air-dried ash, stacked outside under canvas since August, burned 50 minutes and produced visible steam for the first 10. Lydia arrived at Nora's cabin on the 7th day with a slate and a piece of chalk. She sat at the table and said, "Show me." Nora took her to the vault. She did not explain the system in words. She showed it in sequence: the gravel floor, then the raised slats, then the side planks, then the sod insulation, then the front intake, then the rear exhaust. She had Lydia feel the air moving through the intake. She had Amos drop a feather near the low vent, and they watched it twitch with the draft, dancing sideways, and then pulling gently inward. Then Nora placed 2 sticks side by side on the gravel floor, one vault split and one of Lydia's outside stacked splits that Thomas had carried over for comparison. Nora lit a shaving from each. The vault shaving caught instantly, flared, and burned with a clean yellow flame. Lydia's shaving sputtered, darkened at the edges, hissed once, and burned with a bluish flame that meant moisture. "The wood is the same species," Nora said. "The same thickness, the same age. The difference is where it spent the winter." Lydia picked up the vault split and hefted it. She picked up her own split and hefted it. The difference in weight was obvious. The vault split was a third lighter. "Water," Lydia said. "Water," Nora said. "My father said it hides inside the grain the way debt hides in a ledger. You cannot see it, but when you try to burn it, you're spending heat to boil water instead of warming a room." Lydia wrote on her slate, "Floor off ground, drain to low side, vent top and bottom, cover top, open sides." 1 year minimum. It was the first written copy of Gideon's principles. Nora had not asked her to write them down. Lydia had decided on her own that knowledge this specific deserved a record. "Dale will want to see this when he comes home," Lydia said. "He will say it is too much work." "It is too much work for 1 season," Nora said. "It is not too much work for a lifetime." Lydia left with the slate and 2 more splits for her stove. She did not say thank you. She said, "I will bring back the chalk marks tomorrow." It meant she was planning to count her own wood supply and compare it to what the vault could teach her. It meant she was already building next year's solution in her head. Calvin Voss's response was neither silence nor curiosity. It was calculation. News of the vault reached him through the same channels that carried every other piece of information on the prairie, through men who stopped at his store to warm themselves and trade gossip for heat. Within a week of the blizzard, every person between De Smet and the creek knew that Gideon Vale's daughter had found 20 cords of dry wood inside a hill. The story grew in the telling, as stories do. Some versions said 30 cords. Some said the wood glowed. One version, which Nora heard from Thomas and did not dignify with a response, said Gideon had sealed a dead man inside the vault as a guardian. Voss listened to all of these stories from behind his counter. He sold coal and lamp oil and credit, and did not comment on the vault or Nora or the wood. He waited. The waiting ended on the 10th day, when Voss rode to Nora's claim on a horse that looked better fed than any animal on the prairie. He arrived at mid-morning, dismounted, tied the horse to the barn post, and stood in the yard looking at the hillside with the expression of a man appraising property he intends to acquire. Nora was inside the vault, restacking the rear section with burnt. She heard the horse and came out to find Voss standing at the door with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat tipped back. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I have heard about your father's cellar." "It is not a cellar." "Vault, then. I have heard the community has been generous with your door." "I have been generous with my door." Voss smiled. It was the smile she remembered from the store. The expression of a man who has decided to say no but wants you to feel welcome first, except now inverted. The expression of a man who wants something and wants you to feel flattered before you realize what it costs. "You have 20 cords," Voss said. "You need perhaps 6 for yourself. That leaves 14. 14 cords at a fair price. Say $2 a cord is $28. Enough to clear your note and leave $1 for flour. I am not selling the wood. I am not asking you to sell it. I am offering to manage the distribution. Through my store, families come to me. I keep the account, I ensure fair allocation, and I take a reasonable handling fee. $1 per cord." The proposal was elegant in its cruelty. Voss would position himself as the middleman between Nora's vault and every family that needed heat. He would take $1 from every cord distributed, including the cords Nora had already given away free. He would convert her generosity into his revenue, and he would do it under the language of fairness and order. "No," Nora said. Voss's smile tightened. "Mrs. Mercer, you have a $27 note due in 5 weeks. You have no income. You have a resource that the community needs, and you are distributing it without system or record. That is charity, not management. Charity runs out." "I have a ledger," Nora said. "My father's. I record every armload that leaves this vault, who received it, when, what they owe in spring labor. I have a system, Mr. Voss. It is simply not yours." Voss looked at the vault door. He looked at the hill above it. He was calculating, not the wood, but the angles, the legal angles, the social angles, the economic angles. "Your father cut that wood from the creek bottom," Voss said. "The creek timber rights have been contested since 1878. If someone were to challenge the provenance of that wood—" "My father bought the rights to storm-felled hardwood from Pater Stensland's farm near the Big Sioux in 1878, Nora said. "The purchase is recorded in his ledger with Stensland's mark and the date. The wood was hauled by team over 3 months. The species, quantities, and locations are documented. Every stick in that vault has a line in a book." Voss said nothing for 5 seconds. It was the particular silence of a man who has reached for a lever and found it already removed. "You keep a careful record," he said. "I keep my father's record." Records can be questioned. Records with witness marks and dates are harder to question than accusations without them. Voss mounted his horse. He looked down at Nora from the saddle. The physical elevation deliberate, the message clear. "I hold your note, Mrs. Mercer. $27, due December. That has not changed." He rode away. Nora watched him cross the field until the snow swallowed him. Bernd appeared at the vault door behind her. "He will come back," Bernd said. "I know." "He will come back with something you have not planned for." "I know that too." Bernd nodded. He went back inside the vault. Nora heard him tapping a post. That habit he had of testing structure, listening for weakness, keeping his hands in conversation with the materials around him. She went to the cabin and opened her father's ledger. She wrote the date, Voss's visit, and his offer. She wrote the number he had named, $1 per cord. She wrote her answer, no. Then she turned back to the purchase records Gideon had kept and traced the lines with her finger, Stensland's mark, the species, the dates, the locations. Each entry was a small fortress built from specifics, reinforced with precision. Gideon had measured the wood, and he had measured the law, and he had put them both in the same book. Bernd, Kvame, and Nora inspected the rear flue together on the 11th day, during a brief thaw that softened the crust on the hill enough to climb without rope. The flue pipe emerged from the sod at the crest of the hill, a section of clay drain tile roughly 8 inches in diameter, connected to a short elbow of stovepipe that pointed downwind. The bird nest Nora had cleared was visible as compressed debris at the base of the tile. The frost seal had melted. The draw was strong. Bernd held a strip of cloth over the opening, and it snapped taut. "Good," he said. "But the tile is cracked." He pointed to a hairline fracture that ran from the rim down 3 inches into the clay. "Frost did that. Another winter and it will split open. Water will follow the crack into the sod layer, and from there it reaches the ceiling timbers." "Can it be repaired?" "Replaced, with another tile section, but not until spring when the ground softens." They stood at the top of the hill. The prairie stretched in every direction, white, flat, enormous, indifferent. From this vantage, Nora could see 3 claims. The nearest was Lydia's, marked by a thread of smoke from her stovepipe. The second was Orrin Meach's dugout, which showed no smoke at all. The third was a distant smudge that might have been the Haugen place or might have been a shadow on the snow. "My father and you argued about ventilation," Nora said. Bernd smiled. It changed his face entirely. He looked for a moment like the young man he had been before the Black Hills and the mine collapse, and the years of cold that aged Norwegian bones faster than Norwegian spirits. 2 hours, he said. I said cool air drops and pushes warm air up. He said warm air rises and pulls cool air in. We drew diagrams in the dirt. My wife, she was alive then, brought us coffee and said we were both describing a wind and should stop arguing about which end it started from. She was right. She was always right. That was the difficulty of being married to her. They walked the hill together, Burnt pointing out features Nora had not noticed. The sod over the vault was thicker on the north side. Gideon had built it up to insulate against the prevailing cold. The south face was thinner, allowing the earth to absorb what little winter sun reached it. The drainage trench ran south-southeast toward the ravine, following the natural grade so that snowmelt would flow away from the vault rather than pooling at the door. He thought about water the way most men think about fire, Burnt said, as the thing that decides everything. Nora looked at the old carpenter. His bad leg was worse today. She could see it in the way he shifted his weight every few seconds, searching for a position that did not hurt. His hands, those oversized hands that could tap a hinge and hear the room behind it, were cracked across the knuckles from cold. He was 58 years old, and he walked like 70. "Why did you come?" she asked. Not why he had come today. Why he had come at all, that first morning, when she was prying at the door with a stove poker and the whole township thought she was digging for gophers. Burnt looked at the smoke rising from Nora's stovepipe. Clean, thin, the color of nothing. "Because I owed your father a debt," he said. "Not money, attention. He tried to show me this vault, and I told him I would come by next week. Next week became next month. Next month became next spring. Then he died." Burnt shifted his weight again, wincing. "I came because next week had run out." They went back down the hill. Burnt showed Nora how to build a temporary cap for the cracked flue tile using a piece of tin bent into a hood and wired over the opening. The cap would shed snow and rain, but allow the draw to continue. It would last until spring, when the tile could be replaced. "Never trust a dry room until you know where water goes," Burnt said. He was fitting the tin cap, his fingers working the wire with the automatic precision of a man who has shaped metal for 40 years. Water is patient. It will find the crack you missed. It will follow the seam you sealed last. It will wait for the freeze that opens a gap you closed in summer. "You sound like my father," Nora said. "I sound like every man who has lost something to water." If this story reminds you why preparation matters before anyone else understands it, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The teaching spread faster than Nora expected. Within 2 weeks of the blizzard, she had given demonstrations to 9 families. Not lectures. She refused to stand in front of people and talk. She brought them to the vault, 2 or 3 at a time, and showed them. She showed Lydia and 2 other women how to smell the difference between dry wood and damp bark. She showed Tolaf Haugen's 12-year-old son how to build a measuring crib. 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, so the boy could understand what a cord actually meant before he stacked one. She showed Ephraim Rudd's hired man how to stack splits on a raised floor with gaps between the rows for airflow, covering only the top against rain and leaving the sides open so the wind could circulate. She showed children. She had Ruth's schoolmates come to the vault in groups of 3, and she handed each child 2 splits, one dry, one damp, and had them knock the splits together. The children learned the sound before they understood the science. The sharp crack of dry wood became a game. They competed to find the driest split, holding pieces to their ears and tapping with their knuckles the way Burnt had tapped the door. Nora did not realize she was building a curriculum. She was solving immediate problems. This family has wet wood. That family has no storage. This man stacks his cordwood on bare ground where the snowmelt wicks up through the bottom layers. But each solution she demonstrated became a lesson that the family carried home and applied, and each application created a question that brought them back. Burnt watched this from the edges. He repaired hinges and sharpened tools and said little, but one afternoon, while Nora was showing 2 men from the south claims how to test wood moisture by weighing a split before and after placing it near a stove for an hour, Burnt said something that stopped her mid-sentence. You are doing what your father could not do. What do you mean? Gideon understood wood. He did not understand people. He measured in numbers, and numbers made people feel small. You measure in demonstrations, and demonstrations make people feel capable. It was the only compliment Burnt ever gave her that was not about carpentry. Burnt Kvama developed pneumonia on the 4th of January, 1881. He had spent 2 days helping Orrin Meach repair a collapsed flue in the bachelor's dugout. The dugout was damp, the air was foul, and the work required Burnt to lie on his back in a crawl space beneath the stovepipe, fitting sections of replacement tile with his hands above his head, while water dripped from the sod ceiling onto his chest. He was 58 years old, and his lungs had been weakened by years of mine dust in the Black Hills, and the combination of cold air, damp earth, and sustained exertion produced exactly the result that any doctor in the territory could have predicted. He walked from Orrin's dugout to Lydia's house, the nearest warm structure, and collapsed on the step. Lydia put him in the spare bed. Nora came within the hour, having received word from Thomas, and found Burnt lying on his back with his coat still on and his breathing making a sound like paper tearing. "The dugout flue is fixed," he said. "I do not care about the dugout flue." "You should. He had the pipe angle wrong. I set it at 15 degrees. That will draw clean through March if he does not fill it with birds." He coughed. The cough came from deep inside his chest, the kind of cough that moves through the body in waves and leaves the muscles aching. Nora pulled his coat off and covered him with 2 blankets. His skin was hot to the touch. His eyes were bright with fever. Over the next 3 days, Nora divided her time between the vault, the cabin, and Lydia's spare room. She fed her children in the morning, stacked and distributed wood until midday, and then sat with Burnt through the afternoons while his lungs fought the infection that was filling them with fluid. He was lucid on the first day. He talked about Stavanger, about ship carpentry, about the particular satisfaction of cutting a mortise joint so tight that it held without pegs. He talked about his wife, whose name was Ragna, and who had died of fever on the crossing from New York to Minnesota in 1863. "She would have understood your father's vault," Burnt said. "She understood systems. I understand pieces. She understood how the pieces fit." On the second day, he was less clear. He confused Nora with Ragna twice, and once he asked for tools that were not in the room. But in the late afternoon, when the fever dropped briefly, he said something with complete precision. "The tile at the top of the hill, replace it in April. Use a full section, not a repair. And bed it in clay, not mortar. Clay moves with the frost. Mortar cracks." "I will." "And the drainage trench. The south end needs to be cut 6 inches deeper before the spring melt. If it backs up, the water will reach the door sill." "I will do that too." "And Nora." "Yes. Never trust a dry room until you know where water goes." He said it the same way he had said it on the hilltop, with the same emphasis, as if the words carried more weight than the voice that shaped them. It was not new advice. It was the same lesson repeated, because Burnt knew it was the lesson that mattered most, and he knew he would not be available to repeat it again. Burnt Kavami died on the 7th of January, 1881, in Lydia Carver's spare bed, with his gloves stiff with clay on the table beside him and Nora's hand on his arm. The sound in his chest had changed in the final hour, from the paper-tearing rasp of pneumonia to a quieter sound, a settling, the way a structure settles when the last timber has been placed, and the weight distributes itself evenly, and the building decides it is finished. Nora sat with him for 20 minutes after the breathing stopped. Lydia stood in the doorway and did not speak. The cabin was warm. Lydia's stove was burning vault oak that Nora had given her, and the warmth felt wrong, the way comfort feels wrong in the presence of loss. She took Burnt's gloves from the table. They were stiff and cracked and smelled of clay and iron. She carried them home and placed them on the shelf beside Gideon's ledger, where they would stay for the next 30 years. The carpenter's square, Gideon's old tool, the one Burnt had kept since Gideon's death, Burnt had left in the vault, leaning against the 5th post where the chalk mark read 5. Nora found it the next morning and understood that he had placed it there deliberately, not as a gift, as a transfer. The square belonged to the vault the way a captain's compass belongs to the ship. Whoever kept the vault kept the square. Something had changed in the air around Nora Mercer. The woman who had stood in Voss's store buying a hacksaw blade with her last dime was not the same woman who walked the vault aisle now, counting stacks, checking the draw, recording distributions in Gideon's ledger with her own hand. The vault had not made her different. It had revealed what was already there, the capacity to measure, to plan, to hold steady when the numbers looked impossible. Burnt had seen it the first morning when he watched her clear the sill instead of prying from the top. Gideon had known it years before that, when he built a room he could not show her and trusted that she would find it when it mattered. The mentor was gone. The principles remained. And the winter was not over. The secondary crisis arrived in February, during a thaw that every farmer on the prairie mistook for the beginning of the end. For 3 days the temperature climbed above freezing, snow melted, water ran. The road reappeared. Men who had been trapped on their claims for weeks rode into town and stood blinking in the sunlight like prisoners released from a cell. The mood was relief, celebration, the irrational optimism that comes from surviving something terrible and assuming the worst has passed. The worst had not passed. The thaw was a pause, not an ending, and what it left behind was worse than snow. 2 families, the Meach claim and a new homesteader named Groff, who had arrived in November, had attempted to imitate Nora's vault. They had dug shallow holes in south-facing slopes, stacked their remaining wood inside, and covered the openings with canvas and sod. They had not installed drainage. They had not raised the floor. They had not provided ventilation. They had dug holes and put wood in them, and for 6 weeks the frozen ground had kept the wood reasonably dry because ice is a seal. The thaw broke the seal. Water from the melting snow ran down the slopes and into the uncovered openings. The wood, which had been sitting on bare earth, wicked the water up through the bottom stacks like a sponge drawing from a puddle. Within 24 hours, the lower layers were soaked. Within 48, the water had reached the upper stacks. On the 3rd day, when the temperature plummeted back to 5 below zero, everything froze. The Meach cellar became a solid block of ice with firewood trapped inside it like insects in amber. Groff's was worse. The water had pooled at the back and frozen into a sheet that cracked 2 support poles, collapsing the sod roof onto the top stacks and burying them under 300 pounds of frozen earth. Orrin Meach came to Nora's door at dawn on the 4th day. His face was the face of a man who has tried to build something and watched it fail, and the failure was worse than never having tried because it contained hope that was now dead. "It is gone," he said. "All of it, frozen solid. I cannot split it free." Nora went with him. She looked at the cellar, a shallow trench in a hillside, maybe 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide, with no gravel, no floor, no ventilation. The ice was 4 inches thick across the floor. The wood was visible through it, dark shapes in a white matrix, unreachable. She felt 2 things simultaneously, sympathy for the man who had lost his fuel, and anger, not at Orrin, but at the situation, because this failure would become Voss's weapon. Every bad imitation of the vault was evidence that the vault was luck, not principle. Every frozen cellar was a story Voss could tell at his store. The hill trick failed. The idea was wrong. Nora's success was an accident that others could not replicate, and Voss was already telling it. By the afternoon of the 4th day, 2 men had arrived at Nora's claim saying they had heard at Voss's store that the hill trick was a hoax, and the wood in Nora's vault had been planted there by someone before Gideon's death. The story was absurd. 20 cords of wood does not appear by accident, but absurdity had never stopped gossip, and gossip did not require evidence. Nora had to act, not to save her reputation. Reputations were abstract and she was dealing in concrete, but to save the 2 families whose wood was now locked in ice, and to prevent the next thaw from doing the same thing to anyone else who had copied the vault without understanding it. She organized a work crew. Ephraim, whose conversion was now complete and whose authority as road overseer carried weight, helped her gather 6 men from neighboring claims. They went to the meech cellar first. Burnt's lesson governed everything she did. Never trust a dry room until you know where water goes. The water had gone exactly where an undrained cellar would send it, to the lowest point, which was the floor, which was bare earth, which was now ice. The solution was not to fight the ice, but to give the water somewhere else to go before the next thaw. Nora directed the men to cut a relief trench from the back of the cellar downhill to a drainage point 30 feet away. The trench was 18 inches deep and 12 inches wide, narrow enough to dig in frozen ground, wide enough to carry meltwater. They lined the bottom with creek gravel that Tolef Haugen's boy dragged on a sled from the ravine. Then she had them raise the remaining wood off the floor. They built a crude platform from fence rails and stacked the salvageable splits on top, creating a 6-inch gap between the wood and the ice. When the next thaw came, the water would drain through the trench instead of pooling, and the raised floor would keep the bottom stacks out of contact with the wet ground. They saved roughly half of Meech's wood. The other half was either frozen into the floor or too water damaged to recover. Splits that had absorbed so much moisture they weighed twice their dry weight and would produce more steam than heat. Groff's cellar was worse. The roof collapse had crushed the top stacks and mixed sod with the wood. Nora and the crew pulled what they could, but the loss was nearly total. Groff stood at the edge and watched with the expression of a man who has just learned that copying a shape is not the same as understanding a system. Nora spoke to both men and to the crew and to the women who had gathered at the edge of the work, and she spoke not as a lecturer, but as someone correcting a mistake she felt responsible for. "The vault is not a hole," she said. "A hole collects water. The vault sheds water. The difference is slope, floor, vent, and drain. If you leave out any one of them, you have a hole." She drew it in the snow with a stick, the gravel layer, the raised slats, the slope of the drainage trench, the positions of the intake and exhaust. It was the first time she had drawn Gideon's system as a diagram, and the simplicity of the drawing surprised even her. 4 elements. That was all. 4 elements that work together to do one thing: keep water away from wood. "My father spent 2 years building the vault," Nora said. "He spent longer than that understanding why it worked. You cannot build the second year's work without the first year's understanding." Orrin Meech looked at the drawing in the snow. He looked at the trench his neighbors had dug for him. He looked at Nora. "I copied what I could see," he said. "I could not see the parts underground." "No one can," Nora said. "That is why you have to know they are there." Voss seized on the failures. He did not come to the work site. He did not offer help. He sold coal to Groff at $3 a sack, the same price as before the blizzard, the same price as always, and told anyone who would listen that the hill trick was a curiosity that worked for one woman with one vault that her father happened to build in exactly the right spot. "She is not a builder," Voss told the men at his store. "She is a finder. She found what Gideon left. That is not the same as understanding it." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth that Nora had already swallowed and digested. She had found the vault. She had not built it. The question was whether finding it and learning it and teaching it was less valid than building it, and that question had an answer that Voss would not like. Gideon had built the vault alone. Nora was teaching 20 families to build their own. But Voss's next move was not rhetorical. It was financial. On the 12th of February, Nora received a written notice, delivered by a boy from town, not by Voss himself, that the $27 note on Edwin's harness was being called. Voss was demanding full payment by March 1st, not December, as originally agreed. March 1st, 3 weeks away. The legal basis was thin. The original note said December, not March. But Voss was betting that Nora could not afford a lawyer and would not know the difference. He was betting that the pressure of a called note would force her to accept his distribution deal, or sell the vault wood outright, or surrender Gideon's tools in trade. Nora read the notice at the table by lamplight while the children slept. She read it twice. She placed it beside Gideon's ledger on the shelf. Then she opened the ledger and began counting. Not wood, distributions. Every armload she had given away since the blizzard, recorded by date, recipient, species, and quantity. Every family, every promise of spring labor, every agreement made in good faith between a woman with fuel and neighbors who needed it. The total distributed came to 4.5 cords. At the market price, Voss himself charged for coal, $3 per sack, roughly equivalent to a third of a cord in heating value. Those 4.5 cords represented more than $40 in fuel that Nora had given to the community. Several of those cords had gone to families who also owed Voss money, families whose debt to Voss remained on his books while their debt to Nora remained on hers. The numbers were there. The leverage was there. But using it would require something Nora had not yet attempted, a public accounting, in front of witnesses, that made Voss's own ledger work against him. She would need the right moment, the right audience. And Voss would need to come to her. The note sat on the shelf. The winter sat on the prairie. The vault breathed in the dark. And Nora Mercer, who had arrived on this claim with 9 pounds of flour and no wood, and a word in her father's handwriting that no one else could read, began to plan. Spring came to Dakota Territory the way debt comes due, slowly at first, then all at once, and with consequences no one had adequately prepared for. The thaw of 1881 began in late March, when the sun climbed high enough to soften the top inch of snow. For a week, nothing seemed to change. The prairie remained white, the drifts remained shoulder-high along the road, and the temperature hovered at that treacherous line between freezing and not freezing where everything was simultaneously ice and water. Then on April 2nd, the temperature hit 43 degrees, and the world began to dissolve. The snow that had accumulated since October, 6 months of blizzards, ice storms, and steady accumulation, released its water into a landscape that had no capacity to absorb it. The frozen ground could not drain. The ravines could not contain the runoff. Every low-lying claim, every dugout, every barn and shed and cellar that sat below grade became a basin. Calvin Voss's coal shed sat behind his store, 18 inches below the road grade, in a position that worked beautifully for loading and unloading freight wagons and terribly for shedding water. The shed flooded on April 4th. 3 feet of brown water carrying ice chunks and road mud poured through the plank walls and turned the coal floor into a slurry. Voss had 12 sacks of coal in that shed, his spring supply, his income for the next 6 weeks, his leverage over every family that had not yet paid their winter account. The water destroyed 8 sacks completely and damaged the other 4 beyond the point where anyone would pay full price for wet mudite coal that hissed and steamed in a stove. Voss's daughter Elma developed a fever on April 5th. She was 11 years old, small for her age, with the kind of constitution that flourishes in summer and struggles in any season that requires the body to fight. The fever came fast, morning chills, afternoon heat, evening delirium. By nightfall, Elma was shaking under 2 blankets in the room above the store, and the store's stove was burning the last of the damaged coal, which produced smoke thick enough to darken the ceiling and heat thin enough to lose against the draft from the windows. Voss needed dry fuel. His own supply was ruined. The nearest coal was in Brookings, 3 days away on roads that were still half underwater. The nearest wood was green cottonwood from the creek, which would smoke and steam and produce less heat per split than the wet coal he was already failing to burn. The nearest dry wood was 8 miles northwest, inside a hill, in a vault built by a dead man, and managed by a woman Voss had threatened, dismissed, and tried to leverage for 3 months. He came on horseback, alone, at 9 in the morning on April 6th. Nora was in the vault, replacing the door seal that the winter had compressed, when she heard the horse in the yard. She came out and found Voss dismounting with the particular care of a man who does not want to appear hurried. He looked different, not smaller. Voss never looked small, but diminished in the way that men look diminished when the structure that held their authority has been undermined. His coat was mud-stained, his boots were wet, his hat sat lower on his head than usual, as if he were trying to hide behind the brim. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. Nora waited. She had learned from Burnt and from Gideon and from the winter itself the value of silence in the presence of a man who has come to ask for something he does not want to name. Voss looked at the vault door. He looked at the hill. He looked at the yard, where a sled runner leaned against the barn with splits of ash stacked on it, ready for distribution to the Hogan claim. "Elma is sick," he said. It was the first time Nora had heard Voss use his daughter's name without a purpose attached to it. Not Elma the reason for a business decision, not Elma the justification for a hard price. Elma, a child with a fever. "How sick?" Nora asked. "The doctor says her lungs are weak from the smoke. She needs warm air, clean air. I do not have clean fuel." "No," Nora said. "You do not." The silence that followed was the longest Nora had ever shared with Calvin Voss. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, the arrangement of power between them completed a rotation that had begun on the day Nora bought a hacksaw blade with her last dime. She had been below him then, a widow with no resources, standing in his store, subject to his prices and his credit and his judgment. Now he stood in her yard, asking for the thing he had tried to control, and she held the answer behind a door in a hill. Nora did not make him wait. She did not savor the position or extract a pound of humiliation from it. She was not Voss. She was Gideon's daughter, and Gideon had measured in numbers, not in grudges. "I will give you dry wood," Nora said. "Enough for 2 weeks. Oak and ash which will burn clean and hold heat. Your daughter will have warm air by tonight." Voss's jaw moved as if he were chewing something that would not go down. "What is the price?" Nora went into the cabin. She came back with a piece of paper she had written that morning, not because she had known Voss would come today, but because she had known he would come eventually, and Gideon's daughter prepared for events the way Gideon prepared for winter, ahead of time. The paper was a receipt. It stated that Calvin Voss acknowledged the receipt of fuel from the Mercer vault, valued at $27, in full settlement of the note held against Edwin Mercer's harness. It stated that the fuel had been distributed to families in the township during the winter of 1880 through 1881, that those families included households that carried accounts at Voss's store, and that the fuel had preserved lives and property that would otherwise have been lost, including the labor and custom that those families represented to Voss's business. It was not revenge. It was not negotiation. It was accounting. The language of ledgers. Gideon's language. Voss read the paper. He read it again. His face went through several colors, settling on the particular gray of a man who has run the numbers and found that they balance in someone else's favor. "You are asking me to forgive the note in exchange for firewood," he said. "I'm asking you to acknowledge that the firewood has already been delivered," Nora said. 4.5 cords distributed to families who owe you money. Those families are alive and able to pay their accounts because they had heat. Their accounts at your store are worth more than $27. The fuel that kept them solvent was mine. The note is already paid. This paper simply says so. Voss looked at the receipt. He looked at Nora. He looked at the vault, where 20 cords, 15.5 now, after a winter of distribution, sat in the dark, dry, and patient. Ephraim Rudd was in the yard. He had arrived while Voss was reading, and he stood beside the barn with his arms crossed, watching. Lydia Carver was at the cabin door with Ruth. The township clerk, a man named Soren Flatten, who kept the official records and had come to collect Nora's spring labor pledges, sat on the sled runner with a ledger of his own open on his knee. 3 witnesses. The community's memory, assembled without arrangement. Voss signed the paper. He used Nora's pen. He pressed hard enough to tear the paper slightly at the bottom of the S. When he finished, he handed the pen back and said, "I sold heat. Your father stored it." Nora folded the receipt. She placed it in Gideon's ledger, between the page that recorded the vault's construction and the page that recorded its first opening. "He stored dryness," she said. "Heat came after." She loaded the sled with 14 splits of oak and 12 of ash. She told Voss how to burn them, 2 at a time, staggered, with the firebox door cracked for the first 5 minutes to establish draw, then closed. She told him the oak would hold heat through the night, and the ash would bring morning warmth quickly. Voss took the sled. He did not say thank you. He said, "Your father measured the wood." It was not a compliment. It was a concession. But it was the closest Calvin Voss would ever come to admitting that measurement was a kind of power he had underestimated. Elma Voss recovered. The fever broke on the third night, in a room heated by oak that had dried for 2 years in a vault built by a man who understood that fire begins with patience. Nora did not learn this from Voss. She learned it from Elma herself, who appeared at the vault door in May with a jar of honey and a question. "Can you teach me the sound?" Nora handed the girl 2 splits and showed her how to strike them together. The crack rang across the yard. "That," Nora said, "is what dry sounds like." Jonas Bellwood arrived in Dakota Territory in the summer of 1881, trailing a well-digging rig behind a pair of draft horses that looked as tired as he did. He was 35, widowed, lean in the way that men are lean when they have been working hard and eating inconsistently. His wife had died in childbirth in Nebraska the year before, and the child had followed 3 days later, and Jonas had done what men on the frontier did when grief became geography. He moved. He dug wells. He repaired pumps. He traveled from claim to claim with his rig and his horses and his tools, and charged fair prices and did not talk about Nebraska unless someone asked, and no one asked because frontier people understood the grammar of silence. He came to Nora's claim in July because the well needed a new casing. The original casing Gideon had set was pine, and pine rots in wet ground. Jonas said he could set a stone casing that would outlast the claim, but the work would take 4 days and he would need to camp in the barn. Nora agreed. She showed him the well. He measured the depth, the diameter, the water level, and the condition of the existing casing with a methodical attention that reminded Nora of 2 men she had already lost. On the second day, while Jonas was hauling stone from the ravine, he saw the vault door. He stopped the horses. He walked to the door and looked at it for a long time, the frame, the hinges, the hasp, the sill, without touching anything. "Who built this?" he asked. "My father." He cribbed the door frame. Jonas ran his hand along the corner joint where the lintel met the side post. "That is a well cribbing joint, notched and pinned. I have never seen it used on a surface structure." He was a timber scaler. He used whatever joint fit the load. "This joint is overbuilt for a door frame. It would hold back 10 feet of water." "It holds back 10 feet of earth." Jonas looked at her. It was the same look Burnt had given her the morning he watched her clear the sill, the look of professional recognition, the involuntary acknowledgement of competence encountered in an unexpected place. "May I see inside?" he asked. Nora took him in. Jonas walked the vault the way he walked a well shaft, slowly, testing the floor with his boots, examining the ceiling timbers, checking the side walls for bow or settle. He crouched at the drainage trench and traced its path from the rear wall to the door. He stood at the intake and felt the draw. He found the carpenter's square leaning against the 5th post and picked it up and held it the way a man holds a tool he respects. "This drainage is the same principle as a well crib," he said. "Gravel bed, sloped grade, outlet lower than intake. Your father understood water." He understood that water decides everything. Jonas set the square back against the post. He did not say anything else about the vault that day, but that evening, while he ate supper at Nora's table with the children, he asked about the cribbing angle on the drainage trench, whether Gideon had used a standard pitch or adjusted it for the soil type. Nora told him the trench dropped 6 inches over 32 feet. Jonas said the pitch was shallow for clay soil and would back up in a heavy thaw. Nora said the pitch had held through the spring flood without backing up. Jonas said that was because the gravel bed was thick enough to absorb the peak flow, but in a year with more snow, the trench would need to be deeper at the outlet. Nora said Burnt had told her the same thing before he died, and she had already planned to cut it 6 inches deeper in the fall. Jonas said 6 inches might not be enough. 8 would give margin. Nora said she would cut 8, and they could argue about the remaining 2 inches in the spring. Jonas laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in Nora's presence, and the sound surprised both of them, a short, genuine burst that startled Amos and made Ruth look up from her slate with an expression that Nora would remember for years. The well casing took 5 days, not 4. Jonas blamed the soil. Nora suspected the extra day had less to do with soil than with the questions Jonas kept asking about the vault's ventilation system, which he wanted to understand from an engineering perspective, and which Nora was willing to explain in detail because Jonas understood the answers. He left with his rig and his horses on the 6th day. He came back in September to check the casing. He came back in November to help Nora replace the cracked flue tile. He came back in January with a load of gravel for the drainage trench extension and a sack of flour for the children, and no explanation for either that Nora required. Their courtship was not sentimental. It was conducted in measurements and materials and the particular language of two people who respected each other's competence and found that respect more sustaining than poetry. They argued about cribbing angles. They disagreed about the correct depth for a gravel bed. Jonas lost most of the arguments because Nora's data was better than his intuition, and he accepted this with the grace of a man who has learned that being right matters less than being accurate. They married in the autumn of 1884, in the cabin that Gideon had half built and Nora had finished, with Ephraim Rudd and Lydia Carver as witnesses, and Ruth holding Clara's hand, and Amos standing beside Jonas with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the closest thing to one he had worn since his grandfather's funeral. Jonas did not move into the cabin so much as the cabin absorbed him. His tools joined Gideon's tools on the wall. His horses joined the cow in the barn. His knowledge of water joined Nora's knowledge of wood, and together they built a second vault, not in the hill, but beside the schoolhouse on the south slope above town, half above grade and half banked into the earth. The school vault held 8 cords. It was the township's first community fuel reserve, and Lydia Carver maintained the distribution ledger, and Ephraim Rudd, who had once told Nora she would not see Christmas on the rise, became its unofficial guardian, checking the vents each week and chasing children away from the door with the same authority he brought to road maintenance. By 1883, 5 neighboring claims had proper dry fuel rooms, or raised covered stacks built on Nora's principles. Not all were vaults. Most were simpler, raised platforms with gravel floors and sod-covered roofs, open-sided for ventilation, with drainage trenches cut to grade. They worked because they followed the 4 rules Nora had drawn in the snow the day she saved Orrin Meach's cellar: slope, floor, vent, drain. Tullif Haugen's son built a storage frame that became the model for the smaller claims. 4 posts, a raised slat floor, a pitched roof covered in sod, and open walls faced with slat panels angled to shed rain but pass air. The boy was 14 when he built it, and he used Gideon's carpenter's square to check the angles, returning it to Nora each time with the careful formality of a young man borrowing a sacred text. The school kept a 1-cord emergency reserve throughout every winter. Lydia's ledger recorded every contribution and every distribution, and the ledger became, over time, a document that held more than numbers. It held the names of families who had given and received, the dates of storms and thaws, and the quiet notation beside each entry that indicated whether the wood had been repaid in labor, in kind, or forgiven. Ephraim Rudd became the unlikely enforcer of a rule Nora had established after the imitation cellar failures: no green wood in a crisis. If a family came to the school vault during a storm, the wood they received was dry, and the wood they returned in spring had to pass the knock test. Ephraim administered the test with the solemnity of a judge and the ear of a musician, tapping each split with his knuckle and sorting them into 2 piles, dry enough and not yet. The children learned the sound first. Before they could parse Latin or recite state capitals, they could strike 2 splits together and tell you which one was ready to burn. Ruth taught this in her schoolroom. She had become the teacher by 1885 at the age of 14 because the previous teacher had left for Brookings and no replacement had come. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography, and she taught the knock test, and she kept a measuring crib in the schoolyard where children could see what a cord looked like before they ever had to stack one. Amos apprenticed with a carpenter in Brookings when he turned 16. He came home twice a year with new joints and new techniques, and the same quiet manner he had carried since childhood, his whisper having gradually grown into a voice that was soft but precise, a voice that said exactly what it meant and no more. He repaired the vault ceiling timbers in 1889 replacing two that had begun to bow under the weight of the sod. He used Gideon's carpenter's square for the angles and Burnt's wire wrapping technique for the flue cap, and when Nora asked him where he had learned to wrap wire like that, he said, "I watched Mr. Kavama do it once. I did not forget." Clara grew past her cough. The lungs that had struggled in the first winter strengthened with each clean burning season, and by the time she was 10, she was the fastest runner in the school and the loudest singer in the church. And she carried wood from the vault to the cabin with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who has never known a cold house. Jonas and Nora had two more children, a boy named Gideon, born in 1886, and a girl named Ragna, born in 1888. The names were not accidental. They were markers, set like chalk on a post, recording what had been given and what would be carried forward. The years compress the way years do when the work is steady and the crises are smaller. 1885 brought a drought that tested the well but not the vault. 1887 brought a blizzard that tested the vault but not the well. 1890 brought a railroad spur that changed the economics of coal and made Voss's store less essential and Nora's principles more visible, because the families who had dry fuel reserves were the families who did not need the railroad's coal, and the families who did not need the railroad's coal were the families who had learned from a woman with a hill. Voss sold his store in 1892. He moved to Sioux Falls, where he opened a hardware business that, by all accounts, succeeded. He never returned to the claim country. He never spoke of Nora or the vault or the winter of 1880. But his daughter Elma, who had learned the sound of dry wood at the age of 11, married a man from Mitchell and kept a dry fuel store behind her house for the rest of her life. She taught her own children the knock test. She did not explain where she had learned it. Some knowledge passes through people without attribution, like water through gravel, arriving at the far end clean and sourceless. Nora lived on the claim until 1911. She was 63 when she died, in November, after a brief illness that the doctor in De Smet called pneumonia and that Nora herself called an inconvenience. She died in the cabin Gideon had started and she had finished, in a room heated by wood from the vault her father had built and she had maintained for 31 years. The stove was burning oak. The air was clean. The children, all 5 of them, were present, and Ruth read aloud from Gideon's ledger while Nora listened with her eyes closed, hearing the numbers the way she had always heard them. As music, as measurement, as proof that the world could be understood by anyone willing to count. Jonas replaced the vault's door hinges for the last time in 1909. The original forge-welded hinges that Gideon had hung had lasted 29 years. Jonas kept them in the barn, hung on a nail, where they remained until the barn was torn down in 1923. The new hinges were factory-made. They worked. They did not sing when tapped. Within 3 winters of the blizzard of 1880, 21 households had adopted some part of Nora's system. Not all built vaults. Most built raised stacks with gravel drainage, covered against rain and open to air. The school cord became the quiet insurance that no one talked about until it was needed, and then everyone talked about it with the specific gratitude of people who understand what it means to have heat when the alternative is dark. Children across the township learned the sound of dry wood by striking 2 splits together, and that sound, a sharp crack that rang like a hand clap, became as ordinary as a school bell, as seasonal as the first frost, as permanent as anything built from wood and air and time. Nora Vale Mercer lived out her life on the claim her father nearly lost and Calvin Voss nearly took. In later years, the neighbors who remembered her spoke less of the 20 cords hidden in the hill than of her refusal to let the knowledge stay hidden. She had given away fuel, but more than that, she had given away the principle behind the fuel. The understanding that dryness was the foundation of heat, that patience was the foundation of dryness, and that a system built right would outlast the person who built it. She died in a warm room, in a clean breath of air, with Gideon's ledger on the shelf, and Burnt's gloves beside it, and the carpenter's square leaning against the 5th post in the vault, where it had stood for 31 years. October, 1880. Sleet ticking on iron. Amos asking whether grandfather took the wood with him. Ephraim Rudd standing in the yard, hat pulled against the wind, delivering his verdict to a woman with no team, no coal, and 3 children pressed against the backs of her legs. A woman with no team and no wood will not see Christmas on that rise. The answer came not in argument, but in images accumulated across a lifetime. Ruth carrying a school slate past the old hill door, its hinges replaced, its frame still true. Lydia chalking cord marks in a ledger that had become the township's memory. Voss's signed release folded inside the cover of Gideon's book, between the page that recorded construction and the page that recorded the first opening. Smoke rising clean from a cabin that should have gone dark, thin, nearly colorless, the smoke of dry wood burning right. And the hill, still standing, its south face bare of snow in early autumn, its doors still breathing because everything that mattered was inside.